So we've talked about rhythms, and we've talked about how they are in proportion to each other. But one important thing we haven't talked about yet that's a part of rhythm is a rest. Rests also have a specific duration, just like notes do. But when you see a rest, you don't actually play or sing anything. So if you're writing music and you want the singer or the instrumentalist to take a break, you would write rests to indicate how long you want them to stop playing or singing. Now we have rests that correspond to notes in their duration. So for example, I have a quarter note written down here. I can also have a quarter rest. And so depending on the meter of your piece, the quarter note might be a beat, or it might be less than a beat, or it might be more than a beat. So we can't assume that a quarter note is a beat, but we know that because of the way that rhythm works, we know that a quarter note will always be twice as long as an eighth note. So in the same way, a quarter rest would always be twice as long as an eighth rest. So I'm going to show you what some of these rests look like, how to draw them, and how to place them on the staff, because they have kind of a particular way that they're placed. You'll notice that I didn't draw any clefs here, and that's because that's not really important to the placement of rests. No matter what clef you're in, they always fall on the same part of the staff. So you can imagine any clef here. But since we're not talking about pitch, I'm not really too concerned about that. So we'll start with a quarter note. I have a quarter note here. A quarter rest I will write beneath it, and you will see how it corresponds. Quarter rests are some of the most awkward ones to write, I think, because they're kind of squiggly. I've seen people write them in different ways. If you see notation that's printed off, like from a notation program or like music that you buy in the store online, they're really fancy looking. I can't draw them that well. I don't really expect you to either, but the way that I think about it is I kind of start with a straight line over, and then I angle down. And then I do a curly at the end. So it kind of looks like a 3. It doesn't even look like what I drew. I don't think that's how I do it. Yeah, that's right. I do it like this. Just ignore me. I've been drawing these since I was 5 years old, so I don't usually have to think about it that hard. That's right. I start with kind of like a Z. And then a C underneath. But if you go a little bit faster, it looks kind of curly like that. So that's the idea. You can practice on your own. But it ends up looking like this. And it's important that you actually have some contour to it, some back and forth, and like a sharp part on top and a smooth part on the bottom. Some people just do kind of like that, and that's not good. We want something that's more than just a squiggle. So I'm going to cross that out. Okay, so this is a quarter rest, and it takes up the same duration as a quarter note. So depending on your meter, your tempo, and other considerations, it might take up a long time or it might take up a short amount of time, but it's always going to correspond to this duration. We can have a half rest. A half rest looks like that. It looks like a little hat. And it's always coming up from the middle line of the staff. So always in that third space from the bottom is always filled with the rest. And I've only gone up about halfway through that space. I don't want the whole thing to be covered. I want it to be obvious that it's coming up from a line. And I remember this because it looks like a hat to me. So half and hat. I know, it's not the same thing. It doesn't even rhyme, but it, to me, makes sense. So that's kind of how I think about it. We can have a whole note. A whole rest actually looks a lot like a half rest, and so that's why I made kind of a big deal about it. A whole rest also takes up that third line from the bottom, but instead of going up from the line, sorry, let me say that again. The whole rest takes up that third space from the bottom, but instead of coming up from the line, it comes down from the line above. So the half rest looks like a hat. The whole rest is like a hole underneath that line. I've heard somebody else, one of my friends said that they think about it like the half rest takes up less duration, and so it sits on top of the line, but the whole rest takes up twice as much duration, so it's heavier and it kind of falls under the line. You can think about it like that too. But it's important that you always draw it exactly on that place on the staff, and exactly in that way. You can also have, you can go smaller, or let's say shorter than a quarter note, so you can have eighth rest. Remember that an eighth note has a little flag. Well, the eighth rest has a little flag too. That eighth rest there starts with a dot on the middle line, goes up and makes a point, and then kind of falls down. And that falling down part is the flag. Actually, the falling down part is kind of like a stem, and this little part that goes up is like a flag. And I'll show you what I mean by that. When you have a 16th note, you add another flag, so you have two flags. And the same is true of the 16th rest. You actually have two little flags for that too. So I started with an eighth rest, and then I just added another little flag. You can continue going. You could have a 32nd note, which has three flags. Our 32nd rest also has three flags. I would just add another one here. I'd probably have to make it a little bit longer to accommodate that. But that's kind of the idea. So these are your rests. It's important that you know how to draw them, and it's important that you know what duration they correspond to. They do have the same names as their note counterparts, which is great. You don't have to remember a different name. You just have quarter rest, half rest, whole rest, eighth rest, 16th rest, and so on. You can also use dots on rests, and they work exactly the same as dots on notes. So if I had a dotted quarter rest, it would be a quarter rest plus an eighth rest of duration, because an eighth rest is half of a quarter rest. So that's how dots would work. And so those are really useful. Depending on the meter that you have, you might end up with a lot of dotted rests. And also, remember that we talked about ties for notes, and ties combine notes in note values into a one longer value. We don't need to tie rests because we don't actually hear sound, so you can just have rests one right after the other. If you need to combine them, you don't need to tie them together, because if you're not making any noise and then you see something that tells you to still not make any noise, you just won't. So you don't need ties for rests. You never really see that. Only ties on notes, but not on rests. All right, this has been your lesson on rests. Go ahead and take out some staff paper and practice drawing these so that you're ready to do that. And I hope you guys have a great day.